Okay, we're back and we're going to talk about the theoretical roots of social psychology. And what you'll notice is that these theoretical roots underlie pretty much all of psychology, right? So these theorists have an impact on a lot of different areas of psychology. So we'll start first with psychoanalytic theory. Here I have a picture of what looks like possibly Sigmund Freud in profile, but then you notice that his nose is a leg and his cheek is another leg. His forehead is an abdomen, right? And you see, the arm is the part of his hair, and the head is his bald spot. I don't know. So you see a naked woman basically across the front of his face, and the caption says, "What's on a man's mind?" Sigmund Freud is most famous among lay people for having this overarching theory about aggression and sex. But in psychology, one of the biggest impacts that he had is his theory that our behaviors and our attitudes are largely unconscious, that we're not aware of what we think, why we think it, why we're acting the way that we're acting, why we're pursuing the goals that we're pursuing. He thought that we are mostly just operating unconsciously. So that's a really big, important thing for him to argue, right? That we don't even know how important our upbringing was. He thought that early childhood experiences from like infancy had a huge impact on shaping these unconscious motivations, that the way that we were weaned, whether we were ready or not to be weaned, either from a bottle or from a breast or from a pacifier, whether we were ready or not to be weaned had a big impact on our personality, on our orientation towards the world, whether we felt generally independent or dependent, he said was a function of how we had been weaned. He talked about how important potty training was. And, if it was done too early, we could end up with one set of personality traits. And if it was done too late, we'd end up with a different set. And that for the rest of our lives, we would have these predispositions to behave in certain ways as a function of how we were potty trained, like whether it was early or late. So those kinds of early experiences in childhood. And some of them are cultural experiences, right? Like different cultures have sort of different expectations about the timing of potty training. And so he gave us a range of ages that he said were the ideal ages to be potty trained, but different cultures have different mores about that. And so is there like a whole set of people in the world who have set up their kids with unconscious conflicts that they have to work out because their culture encouraged their parents to potty train them at a certain time? It's really hard to say, right? You don't know. This is all unconscious. So this idea that your unconscious is actually more powerful in determining your behavior and your attitudes than your conscious mind is really, that's what makes the psychoanalytic theory different. I mean, you can talk about sex and you can talk about aggression if you want. That comes out of your unconscious, according to Freud. But the idea that, the interactions that you've had in the world, especially during young childhood, have set you up to have certain unconscious motives and characteristics is really an important aspect of Freudian theory. We'll talk about some of those things that I said. We'll talk about in great detail in the appropriate chapters. Okay, so if you hear a dog barking, I'll just remind you that it's still coronavirus time and I'm working from home, and so there are dogs barking and you might hear lawnmowers during certain times, so I apologize. Now, behaviorism, you guys might remember Pavlovian conditioning if you've taken introductory psychology or some other psychology classes. You might remember Skinnerian, the rats pressing the lever and getting rewarded and things like that. That's behaviorism. So you oftentimes will, from your early training, remember like those kinds of vague details, right? That the dogs learn to drool to a bell in Pavlovian conditioning, or that the rats learn to press a lever to get a food pellet. But the big principles that you want to really focus on whenever you're thinking about how behaviorism has impacted other fields is this basic principle of you being shaped by the history of rewards and punishments that you have garnered over your lifetime. And so things that, starting from the time you were young, you were rewarded for doing, you're much more likely to continue doing those behaviors, according to this theory. So, if you, as a little kid, were really outgoing and everybody really encouraged you to do that, you're going to preserve those outgoing behaviors into adulthood. Whereas if you were punished for doing those things, either ignored or outright, shamed or embarrassed for doing those behaviors, then you're less likely to do those things now as an adult. And so if you think about it like that, behaviorism explains kind of, again, sort of some unconscious behaviors that you might engage in. They didn't use the word unconscious because behaviorists were not concerned about like a mind, anything going on inside your head, because they couldn't really directly study it. But if you, as a more modern psychology student, want to think about it like that, those things that you got rewarded for are things that now unconsciously you're more likely to do those behaviors, right? Because you know that there's a high probability that you'll be rewarded for those behaviors. And so we'll avoid the ones that we've been punished or ignored for doing. And even if it, as a kid, it was like our natural tendency to behave that way. Like maybe, our genetic predisposition was to behave in a particular way. The feedback that we got from the environment, from our parents, from other peers, from teachers, directly giving us feedback about the rightness or wrongness of our behavior, has helped to determine how we act now as an adult, according to behaviorism. And you can kind of imagine that culture might play a role in what behaviors tend to get rewarded and which ones tend to get ignored or punished, right? So those are really important things. I'm going to throw out here, in case I don't have an opportunity later on. Skinner said that the most powerful way to get another person to stop behaving the way that they are is to just ignore the behavior. Like literally walk away, act like you can't see that person. And this came up when campus was still open back in 2020. We had a person who was coming to campus and yelling very offensive things, and students were gathering around that person and trying to shout him down. And they were calling the media so that the media was coming and recording him and putting him on the news, and a bunch of things, thinking that they were going to sort of silence him by sort of being louder than him or by shaming him or something like that. And I pointed out to my students in my human sexuality class at the time that, Skinner says that the most powerful way to get a behavior to stop is to ignore it. Like the more you engage with that person, the more likely they are to keep coming to campus. Because how rewarding is that? He came there to be disruptive. So why wouldn't he come back? He completely got people to gather around, videotape him, yell at him, call the media. He got all the things that he wanted. He got completely rewarded. And so thinking about it like that, it's really important to generalize that out to, like, let's say social media. You can never shout somebody down in social media. Ignoring them is the way to get that behavior to go away. I'd also like to argue that if you ignore them, then you don't have to hear it anymore either. So that's an added reward for you for ignoring them. Now, Gestalt theory came around about the same time as psychoanalytic theory and behaviorism. Well, they were all mingling around in the 1930s, I should say. Gestalt theory kind of took some of what Freud said, the psychoanalytic theory said, about the importance of your early childhood experiences and those kinds of things, and blended it with some of the things that behaviorism said about rewards and stuff like that. And added that together with, sort of predispositions, things that you may be designed to behave this way more readily than another person might behave. And said, you know what, we need to look at all of this together, right? We can't just look at childhood, malpractice that our parents inevitably committed, like Freud says. We can't just look at rewards and punishments like behaviorists say. We can't just look at genes either, right? We have to look at the whole picture. And in fact, the word gestalt means the whole. So I've got a picture here for the Gestalt theory that is a classic Gestalt ambiguous figure. And when you first glance at the image, whichever thing you see first is supposed to be an indicator of sort of where you are. You sort of, in this case, age-wise. So probably for most of you, when you first looked at this picture, it looks like a younger woman looking away from the camera. And so you're sort of seeing her left ear, her left jawline, the curve of her left cheek. And then you can kind of see the little eyelash from her left eye, a little tiny bit of the tip of her nose. And then she has like a curly hairdo, a feather coming out of her forehead, and then what looks like maybe some kind of veil or something coming off the back of her head. And then she's got like a choker on her neck and a furry stole around her shoulders. And that's what probably most of you saw, because probably most of you are younger students. Like, I'm just playing the averages here. For those of us who are older, maybe the first thing that we saw was the older lady in the picture. And so now you have to kind of clear out everything you know about that younger person. And now it's still a furry stole around the person's shoulders. But now, instead of that being her neck with a choker, that's her chin. The choker is now her lips in a very straight line. Instead of that being the jawline, now what we're seeing is a nose. That's the older lady's, large nose. You can see both of her eyes. We're actually kind of seeing her more from the front than from the back in this picture. And so you can see both of her eyes on either side of her nose. She's got curly bangs. She's wearing some kind of scarf over her head. So you can, if you can't, even as I'm explaining it, can't see the older person, you're really probably, your orientation probably is coming from a younger perspective. Gestalt theory is really concerned about perception, like how you interpret the world, how you interpret your situation, how you interpret yourself within the situation. And so Gestalt theory gives us a lot of insights into interpersonal group dynamics, person perception, all these things. But it looks at the whole, like all the factors are really important to Gestalt theory. So we'll be seeing them coming up. Cognitive theory looks at how we make decisions, how we form attitudes. But the key thing here is that in cognitive theory, we're assuming that people are actually thinking. It's not unconscious, that you're actually thinking about the decision that you're making. You're making judgments, weighing pros and cons. You might not be doing it completely, like when you're weighing pros and cons, there might be a gut instinct component to your pro and con weighing. It might not be the formal, let's get out the whiteboard and make a column called pro and a column called con and see which has a longer list. Like, you may not be that deliberate about it, but cognitive theory would explain how you go through the process of making a pros and cons list kind of mentally. So the cartoon I have here says it's a group of people around the conference table and says, okay, all of those in favor of delegating decision-making, shrug your shoulders. Because a lot of times the cognitive theory assumes that we want to be thinking about these things, that we want to make good decisions, right? That we want to put our full effort into stuff. And the truth is, that's not always the case. Sometimes we take the shortest route. In fact, one of the things I learned very quickly in my study of social cognition is that when in doubt, we will take the quickest route to a decision, even if that route leads us to a poorer decision than we would have made if we really took the time to think it out. And so when we talk about social cognition, I think you'll see that that's really a pattern. We'd rather be quick than right when we're making decisions and judgments. So the final theory that I wanted to introduce is evolutionary theory. And in psychology, we have different names for the role of evolutionary theory in our attempts to explain human behavior. Some call it the sociobiological theory, right? Taking into consideration that our genes might predispose us to behave in a certain way, but our social milieu may kind of moderate those genetic impulses. So there's a lot of, some people call it evolutionary psychology. There are a lot of different names for it, but the basic idea is that we're going to try to apply evolutionary principles to, psychological themes. So, evolution has mostly talked about, how species have evolved and how within a species over, millennia or eons, their bodies have changed and, reproductive fitness and all these different things. In evolutionary psychology, we're really interested in mate selection my cartoon kind of alludes to that. The guy is thinking, what do women want? The gal is thinking, what do men want? Of course, the dog's thinking, what do humans want? The evolutionary psychologists have spent a lot of time talking about basically behaviors that are universal to humans across the species. Now, when I say universal, they're willing to acknowledge there are small percentages of people that this isn't good, that any of these theories is not going to account for. They're those sort of, they call those sort of anomalies. And what that means is our theory doesn't explain it. And that doesn't mean that the people who are not explained by the theory are wrong. Obviously, it means that the theory just can't account for that. But so in evolutionary theory, they're going to talk about these big basic things. So mate selection is one of them, right? Because that's something that's very common across all humans, is to find a person to fall in love with. Other things that are universal are aggression, language, expressions of emotion, and understanding of expressions of emotion. So there really aren't very many topics that evolutionary psychology can really address. There's only those things that are seen across all humans are topics that are appropriate for evolutionary psychology. So it's a very small subset of human behaviors that are going to be, we're going to see this theory pop up and talk about. All right, I think that's a pretty good introduction. Just sort of, in case you're thinking to yourself, I don't understand psychoanalytic, don't worry. As the quarter goes on, when it's appropriate, when we're trying to explain a behavior or a phenomenon, we will then invoke these different theories and show how they account for this phenomenon that we're talking about. So don't worry, you're not supposed to have mastered these theories in this little video. This was just a little foreshadowing of explanations that you'll see across the quarter. All right, so I will see you next in a discussion of the research methods that we use in social psychology.